So I have a confession to make, which is that I'm not as much an immigration scholar like my colleague who gave last year's Ander Lecture, Peter Kivisto. I'm not Swedish. I don't speak Swedish. I'm not Swedish American even. What I am is a cultural anthropologist. I study contemporary societies. And as such, I have a further confession to make. I'm not as interested in what actually happened in the past as I am in understanding how people in the present use the past for their own modern purposes. And I don't see my historian colleagues here, but I can imagine them twisting around in their chairs if they heard me say that. The former is what we call history, and the latter is something we would call heritage. So put simply, heritage is what's left over from the dissonant complications of history when we selectively preserve some of it in the form of historic buildings or objects that we might place in a museum case in almost kind of a sacred way. You sort of place them there and they have a kind of sacred aura to them. Or stories or histories that we preserve over time. These are the ones that we remember. Whereas other things we let crumble. We let certain buildings crumble. We maybe even tear them down. Other objects, instead of putting them in a museum case, we throw them literally in the trash and throw them away. And in a similar way, we elevate certain stories, certain histories, and other ones we forget collectively. So there's in heritage, there's a kind of double-edged sword here of nostalgia and amnesia that happens, a remembering and a forgetting that I'm going to explore tonight. So heritage is really about contemporary social constructions of history. So for me, studying heritage tourism is a surefire way to get at the ironies and contradictions that emerge between nostalgic or even utopian, in this case, we'll see why, utopian narratives on the one hand, and the complexity and dissonance of real life as it's lived on the other. Through marketing and promotion of the tourism industry, and through what John Urry, who studies tourism, has called the tourist gaze, sort of the way tourists consume places in a visual manner, the meaning surrounding places and practices is simplified and often romanticized even further in the mutual performance generated by tourists and locals at heritage sites. So in a tourist experience, and you can think about any of your own tourist experiences, when you visit a place, you don't have that much time there. You know, you might have a tour for a half an hour or an hour, or maybe you spend a day or two there. That's not that long. And so the narratives about a place get very, very simplified over time by necessity, right? So heritage tourism is a great way to get at some of these differences between heritage and history. So this interest in heritage tourism is what initially led me to begin ethnographic fieldwork starting over 6 years ago in the village of Bishop Hill, Illinois, which is just an hour's drive from here. It's a very small place with an official census count recently of only 128 people, although the roadside coming into town says 150, so I don't know, it's somewhere in there, but either way, it's a very small place, but it looms large in the imagination. It has a great origin story, because it was founded by a messianic religious leader from Sweden, Erik Johnson, who thought he was the second coming of Christ. And in fact, he thought he was a new and improved version of Christ. Actually, he was going to be one step better, actually. So he and his followers founded the little village of Bishop Hill in 1846. And they were both looking to move to North America to found a new utopian society. And they were also kind of simultaneously kicked out of Sweden. There was a lot of tension there that his beliefs caused with the church. So, but either way, in 1846, they moved to what is now Bishop Hill, bought a tract of land, and started building these communal buildings to live in and to work in. And then, as the colony got established, in 1850, Erik Janson was murdered by an outsider to the community who had married Janson's cousin, Charlotte. And there was a lot of tension between them. He didn't like this outsider anyway, so they happened to both be at the county courthouse in Cambridge one day in 1850, and they got into a quarrel, and this outsider, this guy who married Janson's husband or cousin, drew a pistol and shot him to death. The followers of the community, thinking, well, he's the second coming of Christ, they laid him out in the colony church, expecting him to rise from the dead after 3 days. And one historian writes that the only thing that rose was the stench. So he did not rise from the dead. Amazingly, though, this did not totally thwart the colony. They actually followed the practices of this, what's called the Jansenist religion, for another decade or more before the colony dissolved in 1861. They finally decided to take this communal society and divide everything up. Added to this dramatic history is a stunning collection of paintings by an amateur artist named Olaf Kranz, created from memory starting half a century after the founding of the village. His work is now being recognized as an important contribution to early American folk art. I brought a book that's a recent retrospective of his work, if anybody wants to page through it after the talk. And all the slides, by the way, that I have here on the PowerPoint are from this book. So, much of his body of work is housed in a dedicated museum in Bishop Hill, established by the state of Illinois in 1988. While he painted scenes from memory many decades after the fact, he's often described matter-of-factly as a faithful recorder of Bishop Hill colonists and their lives. Without Kranz's portraits of these hardy settlers, one prominent folk art collector wrote, we would know much less about this 19th century social experiment. So often people look onto his paintings and think, well, this is really what it was like, when in fact he was doing it from memory. Bishop Hill's importance was eventually recognized by the state and federal government in the 20th century. And another piece of the puzzle here, why, even though it's such a small village, why it's so important, is that it really started Swedish immigration en masse in the mid-1800s. So Swedish emigres moving from Sweden to North America used Bishop Hill as the place that they would land very often. They would live there for a few years and then often move on to other communities. So this kind of opened up, this was kind of a gateway community to massive Swedish immigration. So it's really important, actually, in Sweden as a site in North America. So you actually get tourists today, not only domestically coming from the region, but also from Sweden. People fly over from Sweden, they'll do a package tour in Chicago, they'll go out to Bishop Hill, they'll go out to Minneapolis, and then go home. So it's a really important site for a lot of reasons. So it's been recognized now by the state and federal government. So the village was granted official status as a state memorial at its 100-year anniversary in 1946. It was placed on the National Registry of Historic Places in 1970, and so on. The community has received funding from state, federal, corporate, and even international bodies to support the conservation of its well-preserved Shaker-style buildings from the early colony period. And you just don't see architecture like this very often in, central Illinois. So this is beautiful stuff that you would see perhaps out east. So it's a stunning place to go. If you haven't visited, tomorrow would be a lovely day out in Bishop Hill, you should go. So this has all been very well preserved, and so there's a lot of conservation efforts that are happening out in the village today. And stakeholders in the contemporary village, in the private sector, nonprofit organizations, and the state have cooperatively developed a small but thriving tourism industry that capitalizes on the history, the architecture, and the presence of a number of artists who now operate out of the village. And then also a very busy schedule of festivals and events that happen sometimes weekly, sometimes every couple of weeks. It's a very busy schedule of lots of different styles of events. Very early on in Bishop Hill, as soon as the 1890s, a romantic image began to crystallize around the village's origins that plays into a common meta-narrative about the Euro-American settling of the West. For example, here's a script from a 50th anniversary memorial, sort of memorializing the settlers of the village. This is translated from the Swedish, dedicated to the memory of the hardy pioneers who, in order to secure religious liberty, these are very American themes, right? Left Sweden, their native land, with all the endearments of home and kindred, and founded Bishop Hill Colony on the uninhabited prairies of Illinois. As tourism developed in the late 20th century, romantic narratives about a pristine rural landscape got embedded in the way the village was marketed to visitors as well. Given the history of its founding, it's unsurprising that Bishop Hill calls itself a utopia on the prairie. It was, after all, founded as a utopian communal society. But as my research collaborator, Margaret Farrar, she and I are working on a book project about Bishop Hill. As she's written, this is as much aspirational as it is descriptive. In fact, I'm going to argue this evening that places like Bishop Hill have come to represent a nostalgic and utopian vision of the American past, but for present and perhaps future purposes. So tonight, I want to challenge the nostalgic narrative a little bit by documenting what I'm calling dissonances in the heritage of Bishop Hill, and to illustrate the process of making heritage out of history. So my questions are, how do we filter and even sanitize the complications of the past, and what's left out of the story? What's left out of our frame of reference? I'm going to present you with 3 different examples. First, I want to look at contemporary tourist behavior at the site and see how they themselves are filtering their experience. Second, I'm going to unpack one particular image from Olaf Kranz's body of work. Third, all of this is now amplified in some interesting ways by the fact that a wind farm was developed and built in 2012, a rather large wind farm with Bishop Hill right at its center. So questions about balancing economic sustainability of the village via heritage tourism and preservation with a larger kind of national or global sense of environmental sustainability kind of come to the fore. So how can we balance these 2 things? So let's start with the tourists. So what are we looking for, and more precisely, what do we actually see when we visit places like Bishop Hill as tourists? In 2010, I began an initial period of field work to find out. So I started literally following tourists around the site. With their permission, of course. I mean, I'm not that creepy. So, yeah, I would follow them around, and I would conduct before and after interviews to figure out what they knew about the site. Some people had been there many times. Other people knew nothing about it and had, obviously varying expectations and experiences of the site. So then I would interview them afterwards as well. So I was curious to see what they were looking at as they were wandering around. I learned a lot of things about the tourists, but what I want to focus on here is a subtle disconnect between what they say they're interested in and what they kind of indicate they're interested in other ways. And I conducted a tourist survey as well, so I did a kind of mixed methods approach back in 2010. So with the help of a number of people out in Bishop Hill, we administered a survey. And my colleague Paul Kroll helped me design and sort of carry out the analysis here, so many thanks to him. So what I discovered in my interviews was backed up in the quantitative data. While tourists often casually claim that they're interested in history, so you have this kind of strong indication here that history is a big, important thing. The particulars of the historical story of Bishop Hill, things like the Johnsonist religion or immigration history, rank really, really low. And in fact, these 2 combined are still less than watching craftspeople work. So that's actually more important than these 2 very specific aspects of history. So people are saying history is important, but when you dig down into what their motives are, it may or may not be. It's suggestive that what they're really interested in, if you think about some of these things up here, shopping, the Swedish heritage of the village even, architecture, dining, these are all experiences that the tourists are having in the present, right? So this is less about learning kind of the intricate details of history in the past. So one resident summed it up quite nicely when he said, we've always had this kind of tightrope between people coming to shop and do commercial things and people coming for the history. For the most part, I think we've walked it fairly well. But it seems like since the recession, everything seems a bit more, come and shop and see our events. And so it's a bit more event-driven. It's a bit more experientially driven, right? So there's a more of a focus here on the experience of the place in the present rather than a really intense focus on the history of the place. So that often trumps history. This isn't unique to Bishop Hill, by the way. Heritage tourism elevates some things, some stories, and imbues them with an almost sacred aura, while other things are sometimes deemed unworthy of being subjects inside our field of vision, or even polluting. We see this on a metaphorical level in some of this data here, but let's briefly examine a few literal examples of tourist framing. And again, I would ask you to think about the way you behave as a tourist, because we're all tourists here, right? So when you're out touring a place, think about the way in which you consume it visually. So very often, tourist photographers actively push unwanted objects out of their field of vision, especially other tourists, right? We don't want to take pictures with other tourists, and we wait for that moment when the other tourists have gotten out of the way, and then we get that photographic image that's somehow more pure. So those things, those people are seen as sort of polluted. So, and then we can filter quite literally with our smartphones. So here's an example of, this is actually my own photography, so I'm using myself as a guinea pig here. But here's a common sort of image of the Colony Church. This is where they laid Eric Jansen out in the Colony Church there. And this is from a brochure that you can pick up from a walking tour in the village. And very often what we do when we're taking our tourist photography is we try to imitate the images we've been given from the tourist industry. If you think about this on your holidays, we often want to find that one spot and stand in that same place where the photographer who took that postcard image was standing, right? So we want to kind of imitate it. So here's my photograph of the Colony Church. And of course my Instagram, this is my Instagram filtering of the Colony Church here. But if we zoom out, this is what you see. So we have what is called the Bishop Hill Tavern here. And so for some people, this might be kind of dissonant. You might kind of push this out of the frame of reference. And in fact, I have to admit that when I first started doing field work out in Bishop Hill in 2010, I was so focused myself on the history of the place, on learning what happened between 1846 and 1861, that I barely noticed this tavern. I saw it, of course, but I didn't really see it. And I think a lot of tourists behave in a similar way. So what is dissonant, perhaps for some, is of course the center of social life for others. So this actually has a very busy, active kind of social scene. A couple of years ago, I did a little more field work out in Bishop Hill. I stayed for close to 2 weeks just to get a sense of the place. I'd spent so many years going out there during the day, doing some interviews, and then driving home at 3 or 4 in the afternoon, that I realized I wasn't really getting the sort of full feeling of a sense of the place. So I spent a couple of weeks out there, and there's nowhere to eat after for dinner. So I pop into you can get a frozen pizza there, or you'd have to go to the next town. So I hung out there in the Bishop Hill Tavern a little bit, and of course there's friendly banter that's going on. And for some people, this is really the center of the social scene. It's not the historical buildings. There's a whole other social life, an alternate heritage there that we could celebrate. And in fact, there's this great history of baseball. Speaking of the Cubs playing tonight, there's a great history of baseball in Bishop Hill. And in the tavern, that's what's celebrated with some of these great old photographs of some of the old Bishop Hill baseball teams. This old uniform is actually in another museum across town, but there's this just great kind of alternate heritage that's happening here. And sometimes we leave some architecture, we leave some people out of the frame as well. Some people are not, like other tourists, seen as part of the tourist gaze that we want to have. So this is the more classic picture, and maybe we don't want to include buildings like this one into our tourist gaze. So we're constantly filtering what we want to see. And so this is a literal example of the kind of thing we're doing more metaphorically, because we do this with stories that we tell about a place too. It's not just what we see or don't see, it's also what we say or don't say. So a tourist I interviewed in 2010 compared her motives for visiting Bishop Hill with her experience of touring other heritage sites around the country. And she said, I always say to myself, what was it like then? Here we are, standing here. This structure is still the same. But what did everything around it look like? What was going on around this place when people still lived there? Sometimes you can catch that individual feeling, and that makes me feel emotionally charged. So you can imagine this tourist standing there really concentrating on a building or on an object, really trying to push everything else out of the frame of reference. It's a classic illustration of how the imagination filters and frames our experiences of a heritage site in powerful ways that are sometimes even emotional and personal, like with this person. We try to imagine the historical past by filtering out aspects of the present. And as we filter out polluting objects and ideas from the tourist gaze, we simplify the imagined past. So consider this characterization of the landscape around Bishop Hill from a 2014 Henry County Tourism Bureau guidebook. And there's all this great imagery here about Henry County with these picturesque agricultural vistas, this fertile farm ground, and the promise of the good life, right? A very romantic kind of language that drew the early pioneers here to settle Henry County. I love this line. Dotting the scenery are small towns and villages telling the stories of the land. A visit to Henry County will conjure thoughts of a simpler time. And this quote from a tourist interview, or actually with a resident out in the village. You have people who are just interested in the time period that Bishop Hill represents. I mean, we represent 1850s rural Americana. And there are some people who are interested in that time period, a simpler time before the Civil War. So we get a lot of this imagery of a simpler time. So Bishop Hill sparks an imagined representation of a simpler time, but given what we know of the actual history of its founding, it was anything but simple, right? I mean, it was formed by this charismatic, messianic, utopian leader who was shot and murdered, so it wasn't really simple at all. So nostalgia is nothing new, though. So nostalgia is not something that only is generated out of the preservation movement in Bishop Hill today or the development of heritage tourism in the late 20th century. So we can step back in time and return to an older set of images of Bishop Hill to examine just how quickly nostalgic narratives begin to filter out the complications of history. One might assume that the paintings of Olof Krans, as I said earlier, get us closer to an authentic version of the past. Olof Krans' family moved from Sweden to Bishop Hill in 1850 when he was 12 years old. In fact, he and his family arrived just before Eric Jansson's murder. After serving in the Union Army in the Civil War, Krans began a career as a sign painter with aspirations to become an artist. And he's well known for painting primitivist style portraits of the early colonists. So he does a lot of these kind of paintings. And the museum out in Bishop Hill has dozens of them, I think. Really interesting. And then for the 50th anniversary of the founding of the village, he began to paint bucolic scenes of the communal agricultural work of the first settlers. In other words, some of these images of the very first years of the colony were painted from his imagination because he was not himself witness to the very first years of the founding of the village, while others were painted from childhood memories. In a recent retrospective of Krans' work, art historian Esther Sparks describes how his first set of reminiscent paintings of the colony in 1896 were mostly met with praise, although some descendants from the original colony days had a series of questions about some of the details that he got wrong. Quote, "Such questions may be appropriate for the dedicated historian," she writes, but Olof Krans painted what he remembered. So these paintings are not so much ethnographic depictions of colony life as they are impressions from his own and others' memories, leading to what Sparks describes as, quote, undisguised nostalgia. What's more, this also means that our own contemporary nostalgia, generated by Olof Krans' paintings, is therefore 2 or 3 times removed from actual lived history. So in images like this one. And there are dissonances here too if we look. Let's examine one image he painted for the 50th anniversary of the village in 1896 that is so dissonant as to be rather unsettling. This one is called Helbom in the Indian. And I find it, I can't stop thinking about this painting. There's something very unsettling to me about it. It's a visual story told from a white settler's point of view. Just as the image itself is rather disturbing, with the wild-eyed Swede, Nils Hellbom, dressed in a bearskin coat and hat, growling as he sidles up to a knife-wielding, I don't know if you can see this, a knife-wielding American Indian figure. There's potential for violence here, and it's hard to say who looks more startled. The image references a legend about the early days of the colony, when supposedly bands of Indians still wandered the landscape. According to the tale, reports about a group of native people passing by Bishop Hill reached the residents. So a plan was devised. They would send out the largest Swede they could find, dressed in bearskins. Surely, they thought, the Indians would think Hellbom was a real bear, they would run for their lives. It's a ridiculous tale on several levels, of course, and in fact it was originally meant to be a comical tale. It was meant to be a kind of joke in the first place. If it ever really happened, and if the American Indians were scared of anything, it would have been this erratically behaved and strangely dressed Swede, but surely not because they thought he was an actual bear. The legend itself and Kranz's painted version of the tale says more about white immigrant stereotypes about the primitive savages that had been so recently displaced than it does about actual American Indians. It's a visual telling of history from a white point of view, a glimpse of a lingering displacement and the anxiety caused by a population of exotic others recently removed, but apparently not far enough or thoroughly enough. It is a rare recognition of the American Indian presence in Illinois in the mid-1800s. At the same time, it speaks volumes about the silencing of certain histories and the elevation of others in the process of making heritage. Today, visitors at Bishop Hill are often reminded, rightly so, that the native population had already been cleared from the land, thus exonerating, to some extent, the early Bishop Hill colonists from the act of displacement. And it is true that Andrew Jackson's Removal Act was passed in 1830, and that the Black Hawk Wars occurred shortly thereafter in 1832, over a decade before the Swedish colonists arrived on the now mostly empty prairies. However, the removal of native populations was never complete, and in fact, what became known as the Meskwaki tribe returned to the region en masse in 1857 when they purchased the settlement at what is now Tama, Iowa. The land was not, as the 1896 monument unequivocally proclaims, an uninhabited prairie, at least not entirely. For me, the story in this painting reflects one of the most prominent themes in the nostalgic and amnesic depiction of America's past more generally. Amnesia about the displacement and the simultaneous nostalgia about white domestication of the American landscape emphasizes the taming of the wilderness, a Protestant work ethic, and capitalist and industrialist economic regimes. Something anthropologist Katie Gressier, in a completely different context, writes, she calls a narrative white emplacement into the landscape, the sort of storytelling that happens that gives the incoming white population a narrative of belonging. Let us step back now into the present and look once again towards the future. Today, new utopias are being imagined in and around Bishop Hill, and these new forward-looking utopias cannot be ignored now that a massive 183 turbine wind farm was built in Henry County in 2012, with Bishop Hill at its very center. Permits for 70 more wind turbines were recently granted in 2015. This has been a huge economic boon for local landowners and for various stakeholders in Bishop Hill itself. Farmers with turbines on their land are paid several times per year by the multinational corporation Invenergy and now by Mid-American and Sun Edison, who purchased the wind farm. They get paid for every square foot that these companies use for the turbines themselves, but also access roads, disrupted drain tiles, and so forth. There's a lot of different things they get paid fees for. So it can be quite lucrative for landowners. Moreover, the corporate money that flowed into various organizations in Bishop Hill itself as a gift to the community when the turbines were first built has spurred on infrastructure improvements in the village and an impressive surge of new historic preservation projects. The economic impacts are palpable and positive. As one might imagine, though, there are mixed feelings about the development in the region because aesthetically, the wind farm has a different kind of impact. And here you see Bishop Hill, where the red dot is, and all of the green spaces are where there's tracts of land where there's a wind farm or a wind turbine on those those tracks. So you can see that they're quite literally at the center of this wind farm. For a community that has focused a great deal of time, energy, and money preserving a visual aesthetic from the middle of the 19th century, living squarely in the center of a new wind farm can understandably bring anxieties to the surface for some stakeholders. Some locals and tourists feel that it ruins the pristine rural landscape. It creates a temporal dissonance for those who frame their vision, like my tourist from before, where she's trying to see only the past when she gazes at the well-preserved architecture of the village. So one local resident exclaimed in an interview in 2014, "I'm just like, ugh, it's just, the landscape is basically attacked, it's just gone," right? So somebody who feels pretty strongly in a negative kind of direction. And here we have a trip advisor review here from Dem Rascals from Detroit, who got really grumpy about it, who says, basically, "America the Beautiful gone, I won't be going back." Right? But I also want to point out that most of the reviews, by the way, are excellent or very good. But yeah, some people get a little grumpy about this. So for others, though, it's a beautiful thing that helps alleviate larger existential anxieties generated by an uncertain future in a world of climate change, fossil fuel dependence, globalization, and the Great Recession. For some, the wind farm has the potential to even promote the area. Environmental sustainability might go hand in hand, after all, with economic sustainability for rural Midwestern communities. So yeah, you have a lot of kind of positive reviews of them as well. I mean, they are kind of visually interesting structures. They're very kind of modernist, and they change color in the changing light, I mean, so some people find them really quite beautiful. One local farmer, for example, and this is a group of Augustana students here who's recently done a tour of the area. One local farmer, for example, has been developing tours of his land where he practices careful conservation methods. He's very proud of the prairie and wetland restoration work he's done and his sustainable farming practices. His land also has a wind turbine on it now, and as a central part of the tour, he describes its construction and incorporates a trip out to his turbine to look at it close up. It's really an impressive sight if you've ever seen one of these things standing right beneath it. They're massive structures, so it's a kind of a feat of engineering in and of itself. There's potential here, I think, for the development of a kind of ecotourism if the community so wished. Not the form of ecotourism where you fly down to, let's say, Costa Rica and you go visit the landscape, but in the process you're expending gargantuan amounts of fossil fuels to get there. I mean, there's a kind of irony in that sort of ecotourism. This might be distinguished from that kind of ecotourism by calling it environmental tourism. One could imagine an emphasis on environmental education and a truly sustainable tourist experience with locally produced products, foods, and crafts, replicating the self-sufficient and sustainable practices of the colony days. Some of this is already in place, thanks to the intense work of several artisans, craftspeople, a local baker, a smithy, and so on. All Bishop Hill might need to do is a kind of reframing of the narrative about what the place is all about, and some intentional development, perhaps, of an annual conference open to the public. Although, given the busy schedule of festivals and events, I sort of hesitate to suggest adding more to the saturated calendar. But a new future-oriented utopian narrative of community sustainability and locally sourced, locally produced goods, foods, services in Bishop Hill, in fact, resonates, perhaps, with its colony history in some interesting ways. Today, we imagine the early colonists in homespun linen, sweeping the floors with handmade brooms and so forth. So it might come as some surprise to learn that the original colonists who founded Bishop Hill loved new technology. They were early adopters of the steam engine, for example. This makes sense if you think about how they were actively casting off, wholesale rejecting the old country, the old religion, and even Swedish culture and language. They were trying as desperately as possible to learn English very quickly. So they were trying to become Americans. They're trying to do something new. And if you think about utopia, it's forward-looking anyway. It's not backward-looking. So instead, yeah, they were founding a new society, a new religion in a new land. And they were equally attracted to new technology. So in that sense, perhaps the high-tech, clean energy utopias of the future could be entirely resonant, not dissonant, with the utopian visions of the past. So, Bishop Hill certainly has a fascinating history, and it's really easy, almost too easy, to get caught up in the minute details of its founding. But why should any of this obsessive thinking that I'm doing about history versus heritage in this one tiny village in the Midwest matter to the rest of us? Put simply, there's risk in the process of forgetting dissonant aspects of history while elevating others in order to create monologic narratives. I think we have to recognize the dissonance of the past and the fact that there are multiple histories at play all at once. If tourists visit Bishop Hill to find a utopia on the prairie, we should ask exactly whose utopia it is we are seeking. Utopia is in fact a funny concept in this case. The early colonists at Bishop Hill were forcefully rejecting the past in order to establish a new forward-looking community. The utopia that tourists really look for in places like Bishop Hill is not Eric Janssen's austere and authoritarian idea of the perfect society. Bishop Hill's contemporary visitors are often interested in the colonists' original religious beliefs, but I doubt any of them would wish it upon themselves. Instead, if we're being honest, it's our own vision of a utopian America that we seek, one that can be summed up in the common sayings about simpler times or community values. Ours is a nostalgic, backward-facing vision of the Americans settling the West and the European domestication of a supposedly wild and uninhabited landscape. It can only be simpler if we simultaneously and strategically forget alternate histories of genocide, religious and social upheaval, posses riding in to collect Eric Janssen's cousin. We forget all of these things, slavery and so on. In that sense, it says far more about contemporary America than it does about American history. Bishop Hill obviously has a very specific history and character, but we can also use it as a case study to generalize about the challenges many small rural villages face in a post-industrial, post-family farming era across the Midwest. A recent US Department of Agriculture report reveals that due to rapidly increasing efficiency in farm technology, agricultural employment has fallen by over 14% between 2001 and 2013 alone, while earnings increased by 63.4%. So what you have here is a rapid mechanization of farming through GPS technology and the like. So fewer and fewer people are employable in US agriculture. It's a dramatic increase in mechanization. How can we maintain the viability of small rural American communities? The same report offers one answer. Recreational activities were the biggest growth area for rural communities only after mining. So if you're blessed with a unique and colorful history such as Bishop Hill's, heritage tourism is certainly an industry worth developing. For the last 50 years, the village has made strides to capitalize on the captivating visual appeal of the place and its sensational origin story. The clean energy economy in Bishop Hill has become a second prong in the community's economic portfolio, which also mirrors national trends. Wind energy production in the US increased from 2,500 megawatts to 46,800 megawatts between 2000 and 2011. Most of that coming from the Midwest and the Great Plains. So this is a huge growth area. These two economic developments, heritage tourism on the one hand and the clean energy economy, do not necessarily sit comfortably side by side. But there's potential here to balance environmental and economic sustainability. Thank you.
The communal part, the fact that they own things together, how much does that serve as a resource value? Because that seems very American in some way.
Yeah, I think when you talk to people in the village today, and maybe others can speak to this too, but sometimes I've heard a narrative where it's discussed as, well, that was kind of a necessity of the time, when in fact, people intentionally wanted to live communally. That was a desire that they had. So sometimes there's been a downplaying, I've heard, in certain tellings of the original colony days. So yeah, I mean, you could characterize that as a kind of Americanization, I suppose, of that history as well, where, I suppose, in the Cold War and all of that, you don't want to talk about communalism as much as you want to talk about the industrial thrift of hardy pioneers, and kind of turn it into a sort of capitalist narrative. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a very valid thing. Interestingly, the communalism of the village is partly what helped preserve the buildings. That history is really interesting, and Todd DeDecker here from the Bishop Hill Heritage Association knows all about that history and could tell us much more. But basically, when the colony dissolved, everybody in the village, every family got a certain number of spoons and forks and cups and saucers and a bit of land to farm and maybe one room in one of these communal houses to live in. And so many generations later, as those rooms were passed down from one generation to the next, their descendants spread out all over the country, and you didn't have a single owner of any of the buildings, really, so you couldn't knock one of them down. So that communalism actually lasted in that way well into the 20th century and sort of helped, they weren't being preserved, but they were just sort of sitting there. And that sort of helped preserve the buildings that we have today. So we see that the effect of that communalism well into the 20th century.
In Sweden, when I first heard reading about Bishop Hill, they stressed the communalism quite a bit.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, Peter.
I have two questions. One's a history question and one's a heritage question. Early on in your talk, you said that Bishop Hill became something of a stopping off place for Swedes coming. Was that when the colony, the 15 years of the colony's existence, or was that afterwards?
That's a great question. I don't precisely know the answer to
thing
that
for
yet.
non-members who aren't members of this group to end up there.
Yeah, from what I understand, a lot of people use the community not intending to join the religious community. They just intended to use it as a kind of stopping place. So they would live there for a couple of years and work communally because they had to. And then when they could get up off their feet, they would migrate to the
Was that
Quad Cities of
before or
Chicago.
after 1861?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I think it probably finished a bit. I don't know, Todd, if you know.
Started during colony times and continued on until after the Civil War.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, and then my heritage question is this. Are you aware of any organized tour groups that do kind of heritage stuff that incorporates Bishop Hill with other places, like, for example, Nauvoo or Amana, places like that?
I don't think so. I think that would be a really interesting kind of tour to do, to tour other religious or utopian Midwestern communities. There were hundreds of them, actually, just in the state of Illinois alone in the 1800s. I was shocked to find that out when I started doing this research, that utopian experiments were very, very common in the 1800s. So a number of them are kind of around like Bishop Hill's today in one form or another, Nauvoo being one, the Amana colonies, Bishop Hill. That would be a really interesting tour. I think the only prominent sort of multi-locational tours that occur are really these Swedish tours, of Swedish tourists coming into Chicago and heading up to Bishop Hill. But I think that would be a really interesting thing to develop, actually. And in fact, a couple years from now, there's going to be a Communal Studies Association conference out in Bishop Hill. So not necessarily tourism, but there's going to be an academic kind of focus out there. So, yeah.
I have a question about it. There are undoubtedly different stakeholders in Bishop Hill, and just to name a few, there are descendants.
Yes.
There
The
are
capital D, yes.
there's the state of Illinois and a sort of professional bureaucratic set of people, and presumably there are heritage people who want to see Bishop Hill preserved. But are not descendants, and at least to name three, and I'm sure there are others. And I wonder is there a Bishop Hill narrative that these sets of stakeholders have created, or do they each have their own narrative that they're putting forward in different ways to different audiences, perhaps?
Yes, I think it's the latter. I think you have lots of different people who have different understandings of what the community is about. I think the difference between, the crowd that hangs out at the Bishop Hill Tavern versus people who are super into preservation and maybe have made a career of it or are certainly passionate about it, they're seeing different things in what that community means. So absolutely, there are different stories about the place. And even within the community of people who are interested in preservation and interested in that history, I think people see it in very different ways. So yeah, we should never think of any of this as creating what Ed Bruner calls a monologic sort of story about a place. It's not a monologue. There's always cacophony within the storytelling about a place. So out of that comes some of these dissonances, I think, really. So yeah, I think it's definitely the latter. And you're right, there are a lot of stakeholders for a town of just over 100 people. It's a very complicated social structure in the village, with the state being involved, all these different committees. Everybody in the village is, they have to sit on like 5 or 6 different committees because there's so many of them. Business owners, arts organizations, heritage society. So yeah, and of course the fact that huge sections of the village are on things like the National Historic Registry creates layers of complication in terms of, if you own a colony building, you might not be able to do certain things, according to preservation rules. So there's a lot of bureaucracy in Bishop Hill in lots of different ways. It's a complicated little place. Yeah.
Are any of the groups within Bishopville doing anything to actively promote wind turbine tourism? For instance, can I go to Bishopville and buy a T-shirt with a wind turbine on it?
I don't think so. I don't think that's been done. I mean, I think there's actually potential for that, I mean, that's why I kind of make this sort of suggestion that maybe this is something that could be developed even. You could have a sustainable tourist product, where environmentally conscious tourists might go there and you'd know that you're eating breakfast at the B&B and it's all locally produced food and organic or whatever. You could buy your wind turbine T-shirt and cap and stuff. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And this gentleman that I was mentioning, who's the farmer who does the conservation stuff, it's not tourism per se, really, because he's not charging for it. He works like with the local Boy Scouts, and he'll have the American Legion group come out, and he really wants to show off his farm. He's very proud of it. And so he's got a tour that he's doing, but it's not tourism in the sense that it's an economic thing. But I think that's a model for what could be done, perhaps, So yeah, I think there's potential there. And I think if you frame it in terms of that one part of the history of the colony days, and think about it in terms of how self-sustaining these folks were and how they kind of created this community out of nothing, and they were in fact really prosperous. And of course, everything they produced was organic. I mean, you could kind of tie it in, and the fact that they were these future-looking, kind of forward-looking, technology-obsessed people, I think there are some resonances there for sure. Yeah, real potential.